this computer. Okay, so here comes Isaac. All right. Now, you should see on your screen challenges, challenges in technology, and in the subcategory, you see electric lights on Shabbos and Yom-Tov. And that's really going to be the major focus of what we're going to be discussing. We're going to be talking about electricity more broadly, but we're going to be speaking within the context of incandescent light bulbs and LED bulbs, fluorescent bulbs, and many of the same questions that apply to those specific bulbs also apply to most other electric appliances. Now, again, I'm going to have to preemptively apologize. I'm moving a bit slowly. I'm fairly doped up on painkillers, but I am I am in a certain amount of discomfort. I might have to sit down at some point. So I'm going to be speaking slowly, regretfully, or more slowly than I normally do. And I appreciate your forbearance preemptively. But let's get the show on the road. Let's start talking about contemporary halachic challenges in technology, and we're going to deal specifically. And let me just put my phone on silent, as one must do. Um, we're talking about specifically about electric lights. So most poskim today assume that turning on an electric appliance, which has a filament that's heated to the point in which it glows, is a Torah level violation of Shabbos. That's definitely true. That seems to be the overwhelming consensus, and we're going to talk about how we arrive at that consensus. That said, when it comes to other kinds of electric appliances, things that do not have a heated filament, so when you deal with something like an LED bulb, these are something of a question. These are something that is more discussed or more debated amongst the religious authorities as to whether or not it's a rabbinic or biblical prohibition. The clear consensus is that you can't use either one of them, but when it comes to an incandescent light bulb or a stove top or an oven, for example, all of those electric appliances that have pieces of metal that get super hot, turning those on constitute a biblical level transgression of Shabbos, and other kinds of electric appliances. The consensus seems to be amongst North Americans anyways, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. The North American consensus is that we treat them like rabbinic prohibitions. Now you might ask me, well, Rabbi, why should that make a difference? If it's rabbinic or if it's biblical, a Jew can't do it. You can't flip on a light switch, whether it's an incandescent bulb or whether it's an LED. And the answer I would give is generally that's true, but there are certain leniencies that we do employ when it comes to rabbinic prohibitions, such as when we're allowed to ask a non-Jew to do things for us. In general, we cannot ask a non-Jew to do something for us that we cannot do ourselves. There are some exceptions to this. There are circumstances in which we are allowed to, and one of those exceptions is is when the prohibition is only rabbinic in any event. So it becomes a matter of only academic importance for many people, but for when rabbis have to deal with emergency situations, knowing the difference between a rabbinic and biblical prohibition is very, very powerful and very, very helpful. So you should see in front of you, you should all see four sources. There are four statements that the Gemara makes that discuss heating metal on Shabbos. And this is going to be our first discussion. Why is an incandescent bulb? Why is turning on an oven? Why is turning on a stovetop a biblical prohibition? Well, because we have four different sources that discuss heating up metal. The first source that we have here is source number one. It's the Gemara in Yevamos, and it's talking about how we administer the death penalty. One of the things that the Gemara there discusses is that the death penalty cannot be meted out on Shabbos. Why is this? So the Gemara says, well, because to put somebody to death, besides for the death part, there are other prohibitions on Shabbos that you have to perform in order to properly carry out the sentence. One of those sentences that we carry out is through sreifa. One of the sreifa is burning. That's actually a misnomer. We're not translating it correctly. What exactly is the death penalty associated with fire and heat? It's actually melting metal and pouring it down somebody's throat. That is one of the death penalties that is meted out. And the Gemara says we cannot do that on Shabbos because boiling the metal constitutes one of, or constitutes two prohibitions the Gemara discusses there, and the Gemara goes back and forth. But the Gemara says that the leaden wick is what they're calling it. That piece of metal that is being melted is a prohibition of Shabbos because you have to heat it up, you have to melt it. So here you see that softening metal, making metal liquid perhaps, or even not liquid as we're going to discuss later on, but heating up metal to the point where it gets red hot, that constitutes a prohibition on Shabbos. That is considered to be a form of fire, or it's considered to be a form of cooking. Now, I'm saying cooking because cooking doesn't translate well, or bishul doesn't translate well. What exactly is cooking? Cooking is the modification of the nature of a product through the introduction of heat, making it more malleable, making it better for any particular use. When you think about it in the terms of potatoes, you're boiling a potato, allowing the potato to be useful through introduction of heat. When it comes to metal, you heat it up so that you can shape it, so that you can do all sorts of things with it. So therefore, the prohibition of cooking is also included there. It's considered to be a derivative prohibition or a tolada. The Gemara says that heating up metal till the point that it's red hot, besides for the prohibition of bishul, if it gets even hotter than just getting red hot to the point where it's now where it can now be tempered, that's considered to be a form of havara. That's considered to be a form of fire. So heating metal until the point that it gets red hot is considered to be a form of fire. And so therefore, just as it's prohibited to kindle a fire, so too it's prohibited to get metal to the point where it's red hot. That is what the Gemara there in Yevamos says. The same thing is said with regards to it's source number 2. Source number 2 is from Psachim, and it talks about how is it that how is a person put to death? This is actually, how do we know that a person, when they're put to death through fire, that it's actually through molten metal? And the Gemara quotes the Bryce at the very end that says she shall be burnt, using a very inclusive language, comes to include all burnings that come from fire, even in the absence of fire, like metal that turns red hot, is the extrapolation that the Gemara then draws. So that's source number 2, where we see that turning metal red hot constitutes a form of fire. So if kindling fire on Shabbos is prohibited, turning metal red hot is also prohibited. Here we go. Source number 3. It speaks much the same thing, except here this is perhaps less draconian and less morbid. We're talking here about how they would heat up the mikveh on Yom Kippur. Now, heating up the mikveh on Yom Kippur was a necessity because the Kohen Gadol would have to make about, I think, at least 5 immersions into the mikveh over the course of the day. And if the water was cold, he wouldn't want to get in. It would make it uncomfortable, and perhaps he would clam up, and the purification would not be effective because the water didn't reach every part of the body. So they used to heat up the blocks of iron so that it could be added to the water to heat the water up. But the Brisa there very clearly says, the Gemara in Yuma says that they would heat up the metal erev Yom Kippur. It would not be done on Yom Kippur, for the same reason that heating up metal to the point where it gets red hot is either a problem of bishul, of cooking, or it's a problem of fire. And now finally, we have the last source, which is a Gemara on Shabbos that goes through a bunch of different forms of prohibitions, different kinds of labors on Shabbos that we're not allowed to perform. And one of the examples that it cites is that heating metal is an act of bishul. So again, we have Gemaras that seem to go back and forth as to what the prohibition is. Is it a prohibition of bishul, of cooking? Is it the prohibition of kindling a fire? But we definitely do see that both of these prohibitions are at play when it comes to Shabbos. So we have here clearly stated within the Gemara that heating up metal to the point that it turns red hot is prohibited on Shabbos. Now, knowing what the Gemara says is very well and nice, but the truth be told, you still have to know how the halacha is applied, because the Gemara speaks with many, many voices. Some of those voices are rejected. Some of those voices are accepted as halachic norms. And so we have to turn to the halachic literature in order to ascertain what are we doing with these Gemaras. And here we find that the Rambam says 2 different things. On the left-hand side, you see that the Rambam writes, a person who melts even the slightest amount of metal, or who heats a piece of metal until it glows like a coal, performs a derivative form of a forbidden form of labor of cooking. So you see here on the you see here on the left-hand side that the Rambam writes that heating up metal to the point that it glows red hot constitutes a prohibition of bishul. On the right-hand side, you see that he says something a little bit different. This is a quote from a little bit later on from the 12th chapter of the Laws of Sabbath, where he writes that a person who heats iron in order to strengthen it by submerging it in water is liable for performing a derivative, which is a tolada, which is an extrapolated forbidden form of labor, of kindling, of lighting a fire. So you see here that the Rambam himself also quotes both statements that the Gemara seems to discuss, which actually becomes something of a question. Which one is it? Is it one or the other? So one of the main commentators to the Rambam, the Lechem Mishnah, he actually writes, he says that they can both be true. It doesn't have to be one or the other. They speak to different temperatures. If you're heating it hot enough so that it's now forgeable, now you can pour it into a mold or something of the sort, that you've loosened it, you've made it softer, that it's now usable in a different way than what it could have been used before it was heated up. That constitutes the prohibition of bishul. When you heat it up to that higher degree, when it's now possible to temper it, and for those who are not in the know, to temper metal means to elevate the temperature of the metal to a very, very high degree, and then cool it in a way that hardens the metal and makes it less brittle, less likely to crack, and I guess more usable, especially if you're using it for something like armor. If you're using it like in a knife, it becomes a little bit safer to use. Tempered metal is stronger, it's less brittle, and it has a higher resilience. So accordingly, the Lechem Mishnah says in his commentary to the Rambam that they are both true. You can transgress either one of them, and we'll talk about when that comes into play, because sometimes you can transgress one and not the other, even though to get to the second degree, the second temperature, you have to pass through the first one. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. The Ravid, you'll notice on the bottom. So the Ravid, that's Rabbeinu Avram from Post Square. He was the main opponent to the Rambam, who wrote the famous stricture to the Rambam. He actually, he does not like this. He actually says there's no such thing as turning metal red hot to the point where it's considered to be fire. It's always going to be bishul. And so therefore he disagrees. He says that it's only going to be bishul. It's never going to come to the havara, to come to the kindling of fire. And he quotes various Gemaras and he tries to prove this point. Most of the commentators give explanation to his point of view, and this is very, very important, that halacha accepts the opinion of the Rambam as normative. While the Ravid disagrees and says, no, there's no such thing as kindling fire by turning red. When you turn metal red hot, it's not considered to be a kindling of fire. While it's true that the Ravid does say that, the overwhelming majority of authorities, in fact, everybody says that no, we do consider red hot metal to be a form of fire. And that's going to come out later on, that to be a major difference, because sometimes heating up metal to the point where it gets red hot is not considered bishul, as we're going to say. And the only way you're transgressing anything is if you consider it to be a form of fire. So the tungsten, for example, in a light bulb, it's not considered cooking, as we're going to discuss, but it is considered to be a form of fire. And therefore, we can say that there's a biblical prohibition when one flips on an incandescent light bulb. All right. Now, let's go to the next screen. Okay, now how hot does metal have to be in order for it to be for one to be considered as though they've transgressed something? The Chazon Ish was of the opinion that if you heat metal to about 50, 60 degrees or so, you have now transgressed the prohibition of cooking. So that actually has a very serious ramification for us. Let's imagine for a moment that you have a hot plate and you want to put a blech down. You forgot to do it before Shabbos. Can you put a blech down on Shabbos itself? According to the Chazon Ish, no, you cannot put a blech down on Shabbos, because just putting the blech down would constitute an act of cooking, because heating up the metal is considered to be cooking. And as such, the Chazon Ish says just putting a blech down would be problematic. The Chazon Ish says you can perhaps put down a clay, like a pottery, some stone earthenware blech, but you cannot use a metal one. while the predominant opinion within North America follows Rav Moshe Feinstein and Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who say that no, heating metal is insignificant until it actually changes color. Even for the first level, even if just for the purpose of bishul, it has to get really, really hot. Until metal gets really, really hot, it's practically, you can't shape it, you can't do anything with it. And so therefore he says that it's considered to be insignificant until it gets red hot. And that also seems to be borne out. If you'll notice that in all the sources that we've quoted, we haven't read through all the Gemaras line by line, but we definitely saw that in the Rambam. He says even for bishul, even for the cooking part of heating up metal, he says it has to glow red hot. It has to get very, very hot. It has to get very red. It has to change color. So we see that the Chazon Ish takes on astringency, and it does have some knock-on effects. If you ever go to Israel, you'll see that many people practice like the Chazon Ish, while in North America, very few people do. And we do use metal blechts, and we do put them down on Shabbos. All right, so now that we've sort of cleared the air, we've taken a look at the sources. We saw that the Gemara says heating metal to the point that it gets red hot constitutes an act of kindling a fire. Excuse me. We've also seen that it has to get red hot. It's not enough for it to simply just get hot. Red hot is considered to be a form of fire. Let's talk now about how we apply this to. Let's talk now how we apply this to an incandescent light bulb. All right, so what exactly is an incandescent light bulb? We spoke about it a moment ago. It consists of a wire that glows due to the resistance due to the electrons that are flowing through the metal. The resistance generates heat, and the heat turns the metal red hot. It's usually enclosed in a glass globe with some kind of inert gas, if not in a vacuum. When this form of lighting was introduced during the latter part of the 19th century, Poskim discussed whether turning on these bulbs constituted an act of bishul or havara, an act of cooking or of kindling a fire. The Maharsham, who was a very famous halachic authority from the 18th century, 19th century rather, he suggests that lighting an incandescent bulb is merely a rabbinic prohibition. He argues that an incandescent bulb differs from the fire created in the Mishkan because it doesn't consume a fuel. He says that when you turn on an incandescent light bulb, you are experiencing the burning bush, where you have an item that is turning red hot but is not being consumed. And he says that is so different than the fire that we're familiar with in the Mishkan that this cannot possibly be something that is forbidden at a biblical level, and therefore says that it is only a rabbinic prohibition. So even the Maharsham would say that an incandescent light bulb would be only a rabbinically prohibited. However, the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, he vigorously refutes this position. He points out that the Rambam that we all saw here together cites the opinion that heating metal to the degree that it glows to the point that it's red hot and it generates light, that constitutes the violation of havara, of kindling a fire. This clearly indicates that glowing metal constitutes fire. And to quote some of the later poskim, havara, or the kindling of fire, refers to the creation of light, not the burning of fuel. And that is the halachic consensus. So the halachic consensus is to reject the opinion of the Maharsham, who says that an incandescent light bulb is only rabbinically prohibited, and says that no, flipping on a light switch, an incandescent light bulb, would be a biblical prohibition. All right. So we're now saying that the light bulb, when you turn it on, is kindling a fire. So what happened to the bishul consideration? Well, the Chazon Ish was of the opinion that he objected to that there is another prohibition, that is bishul. You're transgressing two things every time you turn on a light bulb. And he claims that since the wires in incandescent bulb are heated, it turns turning on the incandescent light bulb constitutes an act of bishul. However, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach again argues that one does not care that the metal within the bulb is softened. It's not something that a person intends to do. It's not an outcome that they desire. One does not perceive the softening of the metal within the lamp because it's just it's so fine and it's so soft anyways that it would be imperceptible in any event. Moreover, the metal returns to its original state immediately after the light is extinguished. One of the prohibitions one of the rules about a prohibition is that there has to be some kind of a permanent effect. So when it comes to, for example, cooking, there has to be some kind of noticeable change in the item after you're done with it. That's specific to Bishul anyways, and that is not being achieved when it comes to turning on the light bulb, because the moment you turn it off, it's back to the way it was. It might even have been damaged now that you've heated it up because now it's more likely to burn out. You have fewer hours left on that tungsten. So therefore, he says that it is not considered to be an act of bishul. The only thing you can consider is an act of kindling fire, and that is the desired outcome, that it turns red hot for the purpose of making use of the light, which is what Havara is. And yes, fire goes out afterwards. That's definitely true. But the purpose of the fire was to make use of the light while it was there. Therefore, the nature of the prohibition is different. When it comes to bishul, there has to be some kind of permanent change. When it comes to lighting an incandescent light, when it comes to lighting a fire, you don't have that same necessity that there be some kind of noticeable change due to the heating. And so therefore, the only prohibition that can exist when you turn on a light bulb, according to Reb Shlomo Zalman, and his position is also echoed by Reb Moshe Feinstein, is the problem of havara, of kindling a fire. So again, we've removed the bishul from this consideration here, which again means that according to the Ravid, we said before, who held that there's no kindling a fire turning metal red hot, he would say when he looks at the turning on a light bulb that perhaps there's no prohibition whatsoever. But again, the halachic consensus is to not conform, is to disregard the Ravid's opinion in this matter. All right, now, just to sum up this part of the light, this part of the discussion, almost all authorities find the analogy between incandescent bulbs and the Rambam's heated metal to be compelling. It's considered to be a form of fire, and that is the overwhelming consensus amongst halachic authorities. I wouldn't even say overwhelming, that is the entire consensus. You will not find any rabbi that I know of who would say that it is not considered fire. We say this to the degree, just how far we take this. Well, Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, who was the chief rabbi of Vilna, and he was like the only chief rabbi of Vilna in several hundred years, in the interwar period, especially in the lead up to the Second World War. He was considered to be the first and foremost halachic authority of his day. He believed that incandescent bulbs were so much considered fire that he would even say Havdalah on an incandescent light bulb. So he would turn on he would say the bracha Borei Morei Ha'esh, turn on a light and make use of the incandescent light bulb for the purposes of Havdalah. That goes so far to tell you that is how much we consider to be fire, that you can use the words Borei Morei Ha'esh, blessed are you, God, who creates the light of fire, and use a light bulb to fulfill the requirement that we benefit from fire when we make that bracha. All right, so we've now showed why it is forbidden to do this on Shabbos. Now, this is where the fun begins. And Deborah, are you still there? Yes, you are. Okay, very good. So there's a very well-known rule. Let's turn this here. There we go. What about Yom-Tov? The Mishnah tells us that on Yom-Tov, while we're not allowed to kindle a fire, we can't start a new fire. It's still forbidden. It's forbidden to start a new fire. We're allowed to carry a flame. If we have a pre-existing flame, we can light something else. I guess we can add fuel to the fire, but we can't light a brand new fire. When incandescent bulbs were first introduced, a few prominent poskim permitted lighting an incandescent light bulb on Yom Tov, namely the chief rabbi of the United Congregations of Montreal, Rabbi Yehuda Yudel Rosenberg, who was the Rav of Debbie of Halpern's family. I know that he was the grandfather of Mordechai Richler, and therefore it's a relation through marriage to Debbie. I don't think Debbie is a direct descendant of Rabbi Yehuda Yudel Rosenberg, but he was the family's Rav, and he was of the opinion that turning on a light bulb on Yom Tov is like carrying a flame. This approach is rejected by the overwhelming majority of halachic authorities because it emerges that this comes from a mistaken understanding of how incandescent bulbs operate. Rav Yehuda Rosenberg, in his Teshuvah, when he talks about this, he says that he understands light to be come through the following way, that when you connect the circuit, you now have electrons running through the wire. Those electrons are the source of the light. You need to have a very thin filament. I know you have to have a very thin filament, but you have to have a very thin filament. But the light that's coming is through those electrons, and so therefore the electrons are pre-existing. They were there. They were in the wires from beforehand. Now they're just sort of being transferred from point A to point B, but they were there from before. And as a result, he was of the opinion that this is considered to be a transfer of flame, and therefore it's permitted to turn on the light. Now, what is the fundamental misunderstanding of what the source of the light is there? Well, it's right. So what the way Rosh Shlomo Zalman explains it, and I think any electrician could tell you this for that matter. It's not the electricity that's the source of the light. The electricity is essentially the kindling. It's through it's the resistance within the metal to the flow of the electrons that turns the metal red hot. So that's essentially like lighting the match. The tungsten, red hot tungsten, is the fire. It's the electrons that are actually the match. You have now struck the match. This is a new fire because the electrons are not the source. The electrons, they sort of they're what started, but the fire is within the tungsten itself. The tungsten is now turning red hot. So Rosh Shlomo Zalman was of the opinion that it's not a transference of a flame, rather it's a brand new flame that's now being lit through these electrons running through. It's not it's a brand new fire. It's not a transfer, and as a result, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman was of the opinion that you cannot turn on a light bulb on Yom Tov. This is an opinion that is reflected by most halachic authorities. And in fact, Rav Ovadia Yosef actually quotes Rav Yehuda Yudel Rosenberg and disagrees with him. He says he quotes this opinion and he very, very, very decisively rejects it. Rav Moshe Feinstein doesn't quote him by name, but he also does reject it. Rav Yaakov likewise. You find that all halachic authorities have rejected Yehuda Rosenberg's, and they all agree that it's born of a misunderstanding of the process by which the light is generated. Again, the fire is new because it's the tungsten that's turning red hot. The tungsten was not hot from before. All right, now, so what have we done? What have we covered thus far? We've spoken about how there's probably a biblical prohibition to flip on a light switch, and we also spoke about how there's likewise a prohibition against turning on an incandescent light on Yom Tov as well. But now we're going to have to talk about electric appliances where metal is not heated until it glows, like in a fluorescent light bulb or an LED light bulb, and any other electronic device that you could probably think of. Turning on these appliances is strictly prohibited on Shabbos and Yom Tov. However, and that's also the rabbinic consensus. However, there has been a challenge. It's been challenging, and many rabbinic authorities try to source or explain why it's forbidden. We have about 6 different opinions. We're only really going to be covering 3. So we're going to survey 3 different approaches to this issue, and we're going to try to come to some conclusion as to whether it constitutes a biblical or rabbinic prohibition. Excuse me. There are halachic authorities that say that it is biblical in its basis, and we'll talk about those. All right, let's go. All right. So amongst the very first opinion that we're going to cite is the very earliest opinion when it came to turning, when it came to electronic devices that don't generate heat, that don't create a flame. What's funny about the name?
It's like one of those Melkus Schmelkus.
Well, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkus is the base Yitzchak. Anyways, yes, it's an interesting name. The Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkus was one of the earliest authorities who started writing about electricity. And he spoke about incandescent light bulbs, and he said that that's a biblical prohibition. But he said when it comes to just about any other electric appliance, what were some of the electric appliances that were existing this day? Probably like something like a crystal radio or something of the sort. So he asked the question, why are those prohibited or are they forbidden? He came to the conclusion that they are forbidden. Now, why? What is the source of the prohibition? Well, he says that it's analogous to a prohibition that we call molid recha. So what is molid recha? Molid recha is a prohibition against perfuming one's clothing. I have a scarf. I have a scarf that is made to keep my neck warm. But you know what? I now, because I live in a smelly country where people don't bathe and where hygiene is not an appreciated value, and things smell really, really bad, and maybe I smell really, really bad, and I don't want people to smell me, I will put perfume on my scarf and wear that around. I'm now changing the function of the scarf. It's no longer an item that is used to keep my neck warm. Now it's fulfilling a completely different purpose. And by even though there is no biblical prohibition in the change that I'm making to the scarf, rabbinically it's prohibited because while it's not while it, certain rabbinic prohibitions came into effect in order to preserve the sanctity of the day. Part of the sanctity of the day is that we don't perform any creative acts. This is considered to be enough of a creative act that the rabbis prohibited it, either because people would get confused, or alternatively, it was so that people wouldn't be distracted from the day from Shabbos itself. But a molid reicha is when I'm introducing a new function to a utensil that did not have that purpose before. I'm changing in a way that it can now be used for a completely different purpose. That is subject to a rabbinical prohibition, and he says that allowing electricity to run through a utensil changes the use of that utensil to the degree that it was not useful for this purpose before. Now it is. He says it's comparable enough that it should be subject to the rabbinic prohibition. And that's what he writes. He held that creating a functioning electric appliance is analogous to the rabbinic prohibition to create new fragrances on one's clothing on Shabbos, which is a rabbinic prohibition known as molid recha. Now, Reb Shlomo Zalman, who wrote extensively on electricity, this is how he actually earned his fame initially. As a very young man, he wrote books on electricity. Reb Shlomo Zalman questions the analogy, and he notes that the case of molid recha, one intends that the scent remain on the clothing. And initially, clothing was not made to have that scent, or it wasn't made for that purpose, and it wasn't, and it can still extensively still fulfill that function before and after the scent was administered. There's no comparison to electric appliances. They're made to be turned on and off. The scarf was not made to be a smelly thing to cover your mouth, but an electric appliance was made to be turned on and off. It's not a creative act where you're giving it brand new functionality. That's what it was made to do. It was made to be turned on. It was also made to be turned off. Therefore, one is not creating anything new, and therefore it's not at all analogous to the introduction of perfume to a piece of cloth. So again, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes in the Tshuvas Beis Yitzchak held that there's a rabbinic prohibition here. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman rejects this as a possible reason as to why it would be forbidden. All right, now other electronics. What about Bona? Um, a second approach to powering electronics came from the Chazon Ish. Now, this is still seems to be the predominant opinion in Israel. It's not the predominant opinion in North America, but where the Chazon Ish was of the opinion that any time that you complete an electric circuit, you have engaged in an act of building. You have constructed something. Building doesn't necessarily mean building a building, but also can refer to putting parts together to create an appliance that can now be used. You've created something, you have built something. He held that anytime you complete a circuit, you have transgressed the prohibition of bona. Anytime that you turn off or you disconnect a circuit, you have transgressed the prohibition of soser, which is to dismantle something that was constructed or created. He says that when you turn it on, the vessel or the utensil, the appliance now has new life to it. He literally uses those words. You brought the utensil, which was useless before, and now it can be used for that intended purpose. One has brought the appliance from life to death. So again, the Chazon Ish was suggested that completing an electronic circuit constitutes a total of a prohibition of bona, and conversely, opening the circuit is an act of sosa, or destroying or dismantling, because now you have made the utensil usable when before it was not usable. However, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman questions this assertion, and his primary argument is something that's made to be done and undone is not a problem of bona. If you were to argue that that something that is made to be done and undone constitutes the prohibition of bona or building, then you would be transgressing the prohibition of bona or building every time you open a door, every time you close a door. There was no wall. Now there is a wall. Obviously, something that's made to be opened and closed, done and undone, is not an act of bona. It's not an act of construction, and opening it is not an act of destruction. If that's how it was constructed, was made to be used in that way, then it is not a problem in any regard. So according to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, there is no biblical prohibition, but according to the Chazon Ish, turning on an LED bulb would present itself as a biblical prohibition. It would be a problem of bona. You've now made the utensil usable for its purpose. Well, Shlomo Zalman says if it's made to be turned on and off, you haven't built it by turning it on. This is actually a major difference. If you take a look at Israeli halachic works on keeping Shabbos, you'd find that they very often do say that turning on LEDs is biblical, and it's based on the position of the Chazon Ish. Most North American halachic authorities, especially Rav Moshe Feinstein, disagree, and they say that no, there's no bona, there's no construction that's being created, that's being performed when you turn on a LED light. All right. Let's get to the final one, which is Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's approach. Now, this is one that I struggle with, and we'll see why I struggle with it in a moment. Oh, it didn't happen. Okay, I'll just read it out. Okay, so Shlomo Zalman concludes that completing an electronic circuit and creating a flow of electrons is essentially no different than turning a faucet on or off. And there's no prohibition. Connecting a circuit is not a problem. Turning something on is not a problem. He believes that the only technical prohibitions that are potentially associated with electricity are what you do with it, like cooking. Turning an oven on would perhaps be a problem if you're going to use it to cook. That would be the prohibition according to him. Ovens are bad examples because you're turning the metal red hot. But if you can think of anything else, turning on a radio, let's say, for example. Turning on a radio, according to him, is not there would be no prohibition. The only problem would be if I used it for some forbidden purpose. But the actual act of turning it on and off, he said, is not subject to a biblical prohibition, nor did he say it's subject to a rabbinic one. There is two reasons, however, to say that it should be prohibited. One is because that has become the accepted practice to consider electricity to be forbidden. And he said, who really is going to disassemble their electric equipment to ascertain if this equipment is one that would present a biblical prohibition because some metal gets red hot, or is it not one of those things? He says people do not have the technical skill to be able to identify which appliances are okay, which ones are kosher, which ones are not kosher, and therefore he says you got to stay away from it. And so basically, for Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, the reason why turning on an LED light would perhaps be forbidden is only because not everyone's going to understand or know the subtle differences between an LED and an incandescent bulb, or know that turning on this appliance is okay and that one isn't okay, and the potential for there to be irreparable harm and transgression transgression of Shabbos to be abound is too great, and therefore he said that should be enough of a reason in of itself. Most halachic authorities, however, disagree with him and say that electricity has to be considered to be rabbinically prohibited as a form of fire, kindling a fire. Every time you turn it on, you're utilizing fire in some capacity, in some way, at least at a very rabbinic level. That's never most halachic authorities do say no. There is some kind of rabbinic prohibition involved, but it's somewhat difficult to exactly articulate uh, what the prohibition is and how it operates. So, in conclusion, although poskim are hard pressed to find a technical prohibition under which to classify turning on electrical appliances that do not involve incandescent bulbs, all agree that it is not permitted. However, a wide variety of halachic authorities assert that the generally accepted position is to regard the prohibition as rabbinic. This includes Rav Moshe Heinemann, Rav Herschel Schachter from YU. Rav Chaim Oizer seems to accept Rav Shlomo Zalman's approach. Rav David Cohn, who's somebody who I speak with, asking questions of halacha quite regularly, as well as Rabbi Yehuda Amital. They all say that there is a rabbinic prohibition, and all electronic appliances have to be viewed as verboten, at least as far as Shabbos goes. All right. So turning on an electric appliance is probably a rabbinic prohibition in most instances, in most cases. There are other explanations that are given. I find some of them to be at least one of them to be so untenable that I never mention it, and it actually irritates me that other people do bring it up. I'll talk about that perhaps off the recording. So let's talk a little bit about some knock-on discussions about opening refrigerators on Shabbos. Now we're going to outline some various approaches about opening a refrigerator, and for simplicity's sake, we're going to be discussing opening a refrigerator where the light is not going to turn on. Obviously, turning on a light is always going to be prohibited. That's never going to be it's never going to be acceptable, especially if you know that it's on. To me, anyways, I consider it to be a psik reisha denichale. It's a definite outcome that a person actually desires. People like having lights in their refrigerator. They like being able to see the expiration dates on their pickles. So I do consider it to be a psik reisha denichale. I do consider it to be something that is a desired outcome. It's a known outcome, and there really isn't there aren't too many ways about it. However, let's talk about what happens when a person opens a refrigerator door that causes, and as a result, it causes the compressor to start working probably sooner. So opening the refrigerator door allows warm air to enter, thereby causing a rise in temperature, which will inevitably cause the motor to start activating and probably activating more sooner. So we have to be very, very clear here. Rav Shlomo Zalman, when he talks about this, let's get this open. Rav Shlomo Zalman notes that the discussion here is entirely about a rabbinic prohibition, like according to how Rav Shlomo Zalman understands everything when it comes to electricity. He notes that in most refrigerators, metal is not heated until it glows. He explains that although there are gases that are heated in the refrigeration cycle, heating these gases does not constitute an act of cooking or bishul. Among his reasons are that the gases are not heated by a fire source, and that heating a gaseous substance does not constitute an act of cooking. Essentially, you're just compressing things. You're not actually using a heating element to heat things up. Rav Shlomo Zalman continues to explain that even those, like the Chazon Ish, who says that turning on an electric appliance constitutes a biblical prohibition, they would also agree that when it comes to a refrigerator, opening the refrigerator door, allowing the warm air in, the cool air out, and causing it to go on earlier does not violate these prohibitions, because bona is only violated when turning on an electric appliance. Right? According to the Chazon Ish, it's the connecting of you're now creating the circuit. You're now completing the circuit, rather. So if you are completing the circuit, you have how does he phrase it? You've brought the appliance from death now to life. A refrigerator that does not have the compressor on but is still operational is not dead. So therefore, not dead yet, right? So as a result, he says, really according to Shlomo Zalman, even according to the Chazon Ish, who says that electricity is probably a biblical prohibition, this is not a biblical prohibition discussion here. This is only a rabbinic one at best, and therefore, because of its rabbinic prohibition, it is easier to be more lenient. Now, let's talk about opening the refrigerator door. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that he argues that opening the refrigerator while the motor is running is unquestionably permissible, despite the fact that the motor will remain on for a longer period as a result. He reasons that opening the door merely preserves the status quo. Preserving the status quo is never a problem. And he cites the source for this. It's a bit complicated, so hear me out. I have a fire going in the fireplace, and I have a door open that allows air to come, and there's a wind outside, and it's blowing on this fire, causing the fire to burn more readily. I close that door. Have I done anything? The fire is still burning. It's not burning as well, but I have, and perhaps it might even go out as a consequence of me closing the door. I'm not acting directly on the fire. And the only thing that I'm doing is removing I'm only removing the impediment, let's say. I'm merely preventing the introduction of an impediment to maintaining the status quo, right? The status quo says that there's fire that's coming. The fire is burning, is causing the fire to burn better. I'm only removing the force that's acting on the fire. I'm not acting on the fire itself, and the status quo of the fire is basically being preserved. It's a little bit, it's a bit of a wonky concept. It's somewhat complicated. I'm not going to go too deeply into the weeds on this one. But essentially what he says is that making things stay the way they are and stopping something from doing something that would perhaps change the way they are does not constitute a rabbinic prohibition or a biblical prohibition. It's considered to be so removed from the outcome that it's not problematic at all. Again, I'm preventing something from happening that would have had an effect on the status quo. That's not a problem. And so basically most halachic authorities agree with Rabbi Shlomo Zalman. Opening up the door, opening up the door while the engine is running is okay because I'm only keeping the engine running longer, which is it's not considered to be a direct. I'm not acting directly on the engine or on the compressor. Now, what about when the door is not running? The question of opening the door when the motor is not running has engendered a whole bunch of debate. And Rosh Zalman rules that it's entirely permissible to do so. And in fact, he even writes that even though there are stringent opinions, it is forbidden to be stringent in this matter because it will limit one's Oneg Shabbos not being able to access the food when they want their food. So they're limiting their enjoyment of Shabbos. His lenient ruling is based on the fact that by opening up the door, it will not immediately cause the motor to turn on. There's an inevitable delay between opening the door and causing the motor to go on, and we consider that to be what's called a groma. A groma is a secondary action. I do A, which causes B, which then causes C, which is a prohibition on Shabbos. So let me give you an example. I take water and I pour it on my patio, and the patio, being that it's not earth, it's not ground, it doesn't absorb the water. The water runs off the patio onto the grass. Have I transgressed a Shabbos prohibition? Well, if it was not my intent to water the grass, then no, because I'm not acting directly. There's no direct cause and effect where I'm interacting directly with the grass. Me pouring water onto the grass would be prohibited. It would be forbidden, even if it's not my intent to water the grass. Washing my hands over the grass would be forbidden because it's a direct outcome. But that's because I'm pouring the water directly onto the grass. But if I'm pouring water onto something else and then it runs from that something else onto the grass and it wasn't my intent to water the grass, that's considered to be a degree of separation to the point where not, uh, it is not, it is not forbidden. Similarly, opening the doors will cause the cool air to come out, allowing the warm air to come in, and it's not an immediate result of me opening up the door. That's considered to be a point, another degree of separation to the level where we would say that it does not constitute a prohibition whatsoever. Um, Another consideration here is that even though it's causing the compressor to start working much sooner, still, because the engine would have come on or the compressor would have come on at some point, even without my action, that sort of even makes this less of a grumma. The idea is that in order for me to make some kind of transgression on Shabbos, I have to have some kind of actual change to the item that I'm acting on. Here, since there are too many points of separation, too many degrees of separation between myself and the outcome, and the outcome would have been an outcome nonetheless. That makes it even better. And as a result, there's no problem whatsoever, according to Shlomo Zalman, ever opening up a refrigerator door. We're not worried about the compressor kicking in more quickly. Now, there are some strict opinions. Many eminent authorities rule more strictly and say that a grumma is only if it's an unintended outcome. But if that's how the item works, that's just how it operates, that's just how it functions, then that's not considered a groma. That's just how it operates. That's just how it works. Therefore, they say that you should perhaps you should be stringent. And therefore, there are some halachic authorities who say, yeah, you should only open the door when the engine is running or when the compressor is running. Don't open the refrigerator otherwise. Now, that's largely rejected. And it's definitely not a position that I observe or instruct other people to take on. Um, the Everyone agrees that if I have a refrigerator, that should I open the door, a fan turns on and turns off when I close the door. That's just like the light, and that would be just as forbidden. So the way you would solve that is by disconnecting the fan on Shabbos. Um, Again, also we're dealing with compressors that don't work with an electronic heating element. Rather, we're just talking about compressors, and as a result, the heat we're not talking about biblical prohibitions. Now, Rav Shlomo Zalman expresses concern regarding the defrost systems of refrigerators. Some models have incorporated an adaptive defrost feature that is triggered when opening the refrigerator door. Moreover, some expensive models have features such as sensors and illuminated digital readouts that introduce halachic complications. Accordingly, one has to exercise caution when purchasing a refrigerator and ensure that he'll be able to use it on Shabbos without undue difficulties. Most of these systems here do not have all the halachic leniencies that Rav Shlomo Zalman speaks to. And that's why Shabbos modes on refrigerators are sometimes important, because it shuts down the defrost system. It shuts down a lot of the sensors, because all of these things are desired outcomes and perhaps might even be more directly affected, as opposed to having warm air come out, cold air come out, warm air come in, and affecting the engine, which has a degree of separation. Most of these other systems do not have that same degree of separation, and therefore are subject to prohibitions, which makes it rather complicated. So getting a Shabbos mode refrigerator, if you want to get a fancy one, making sure that it has a Shabbos mode is important, or figuring out a way to fool all the sensors, which I have had to do on some people's refrigerators in the past, to fool all the sensors to thinking that the door is closed. That's another way out. But all the leniencies that Shlomo Zalman speaks to about opening the refrigerator only talks about the compressor. We still have to be concerned about all the other functions that are in new refrigerators, which are more problematic, again, because you do not have that degree of separation from the action and the outcome like you do with the compressor. Again, the primary basis of the lenient opinion is that no biblical prohibition is involved in opening the refrigerator door. Now, that's true of refrigerators. Opening an oven door is potentially a more severe issue because we have that heated metal problem where you have elements that turn red hot. So allowing cool air to enter the oven that turns on the refrigerator. So opening it up can actually be more problematic. Again, Rosh Hashanah only allows the opening of the refrigerator because it's only a rabbinic problem. Once you start getting into biblical issues like heating elements, then that grumma, even that degree of separation is no longer an effective consideration to permit the opening and closing of the oven door, which also is will be the topic of a class in the future. But suffice it to say that when it comes to electronic appliances, when elements are being heated to the point where they get red hot, we're definitely dealing with a biblical prohibition. Otherwise, we're dealing with rabbinic ones. There are complicated rubrics that permit some kinds of action, some kinds of behaviors. In general, a desired outcome is never permitted. Even and if there's a direct relationship between what I am doing and the outcome without a degree of separation, it would likewise be forbidden. Opening a refrigerator, if the only concern is about the compressor, then we're not super concerned about that. But all the other systems, all the other functions on a refrigerator can be problematic, and it's very important to do your research on the appliance that you're about to purchase before you actually bring it home. And with that, we'll conclude the class, and I'm open now to questions, comments, or rebuttals. Just a second. Let me turn this off.